I'm starting this quick take with a single question, a question that's really consumed most of the American media and certainly most of Twitter during this first week of August in 2018. And that question is, why did the New York Times hire Sarah Jeong? Now, of course, for people who might be listening to this who don't pay a lot of attention to Twitter politics or the news in general, might not know who Sarah Jeong is or why people are so concerned or upset that the New York Times decided to hire her. Sarah Jeong was a graduate of Harvard Law School and a writer for The Verge, focusing on technology, social media, and political issues that arose in social media. She really made her name writing about online harassment and troll activities in the years between 2014 to 2018. And because of this record, the New York Times decided to hire her as an editor for their technology correspondence section. Only later on Twitter was it revealed that Sarah Jeong had a very, very long history of making incredibly provocative, and no doubt what most people in America would call racist tweets against people of European ancestry or white Americans. Just to take a brief sample or a brief reading from the list that has been going around on Twitter and other media for the last several days, hopefully sparing myself some of the redundancy for people who've obviously seen these things 1,000 times. Jeong wrote, "Dumbass effing white people marking up the internet with their opinions like dogs pissing on fire hydrants." Or, are white people genetically predisposed to burn faster in the sun, thus logically being only fit to live underground like groveling goblins? Hashtag cancel white people, and a variety of other aggressive tweets, directed almost exclusively at white males or white people generally. Now, of course, as one might expect, these tweets caused a cavalcade of reaction on Twitter from the moderate and conservative side of the spectrum. Everyone was incredibly fast to point out that if any other race, sex, or gender had been inserted in the insults that Sarah Jeong targeted at white males, she would never have a job at the New York Times, let alone on the editorial board. Of course, true to their nature, the New York Times stuck by their guns, when their guns were on the left at least. And Sarah Jeong, at the time of this recording, has a secure position as a future New York Times editorial writer. Now, I certainly don't want to jump on the bandwagon of hand-wringing and recriminations surrounding the hiring of Sarah Jeong, or surrounding the decision by the New York Times to stand by her in light of the fact that she was revealed to express very, very racist sentiments towards white people. And of course, I know these comments are outrageous, they would never fly if the races were reversed, and of course there are explanations. She was joking, she was repeating the language of trolls, except reversed to turn it back around on them. These tweets were only over a short period of time, and while I find the excuses for her language to be incredibly thin, and more or less shown to be inaccurate by a longer analysis of her Twitter timeline, I nonetheless have no desire to revisit the incredibly tired complaints brought to the front by liberalists and other internet commenters when they just expose the fact that the left might have a racist animus towards white people. Anyone who has had any experience with the left in the last 10 years, especially in the academy, has known that this language has been mainstream for a very long time. Its existence is not a revelation, and its perceived validity on the left is not a really interesting thing to get angry over. There's no question to ask that has an interesting or edifying answer to it. Nonetheless, the question, why did the New York Times hire Sarah Jeong, is a very interesting question. Not from perspective of recrimination, how could they hire this person who was so racist, but rather as a way of understanding exactly what the modern political and cultural environment looks like. There are far too many people writing for mainstream publications and with blue check marks and large followings both in the mainstream and social media platforms who are very comfortable writing pieces decrying that this objectionable leftist was hired, that this radical progressive said something that was incredibly racist or incredibly bigoted or just totally unhinged. Yet time and time again after I read think piece after think piece about the problems of political correctness, about the need to defend standards in the West, it seems like nobody is really internalizing the reality of our current cultural moment. The reality of the cultural moment where a Sarah Jeong could be hired without consequence. After all, despite the voluminous criticism and recrimination that had been stirred up in the wake of the Jeong hiring, nothing is going to happen. This isn't going to change a thing about the status quo. It isn't going to change a thing about the culture war. Now, two journalists in particular caught my eye by their outspoken participation in the anti-Sarah Jeong commentary that was filling up Twitter on Friday and Saturday of this week. And those writers were Andrew Sullivan, a notable editor and blogger, and one of the scions of political commentary on the internet writ large, and a relatively new face to the game, Robbie Soave, who most people probably haven't heard of, but who is a young, moderate conservative journalist who writes for outlets like the Federalist, National Review, as well as publishing a few articles in mainstream outlets like the New York Times and US News and World Report, if anyone still reads that. Now, immediately when the controversy started, I could see that people were looking to these two figures more or less because they represented standard bearers for a moderate right perspective. Andrew Sullivan having long described himself as a conservative of sorts, albeit a conservative who almost unanimously supports progressive social policy, as well as most of their political aims in the short term. And Robbie Soave as a voice of reason, a conservative in the true sense, but still one who was not so ideologically committed that he would give in to radicalism. These figures were exactly the kind of person you would see leading a countercharge against the latest progressive insanity. Yet the most notable thing about their reaction was its inevitable facile nature. I didn't even need to read their articles. I didn't even need to review their tweets making objections. I already knew what the response would be. And the funny thing is, that's not some kind of great intellectual feat on my part. Everybody, as soon as they saw that initial list of tweets by Sarah Jeong, they knew it would happen. And it just happened to be that Andrew Sullivan and Robbie Soave were more or less the avatars of this reaction. Just as the blank boilerplate of sorry but not sorry by the New York Times was a predictable reaction. We all knew this was going to happen. There was never any risk to Sarah Jeong's job, and I would frankly be amazed if in the coming weeks the New York Times reconsiders its decision. The die is cast. These objections are not being taken seriously. Andrew Sullivan might believe that racism is some absolute principle, some core immorality that we all decided was untenable in 1960, and then committed to morally opposing in all races and towards all people since that point. But as I've reviewed in other videos that have described linguistic change driven by progressive politics, this definition doesn't hold anymore. It hasn't held for 20 years in the academy, and at this time, the young and up-and-coming editors that staff the mainstream media and who are tenured in our highest thought centers are products of that educational process. Racism in its modern form cannot be applied to white people, and the New York Times, and by extension any left-of-center publication, will never entertain racism coming in that form, directed towards people of European descent or in the European diaspora. And it's not theoretical. I mean, without missing a beat, Atlantic staff writer Jeet Heer immediately retweeted that Andrew Sullivan and Robbie Soave should reconsider their criticism of Sarah Jeong because of the fact that their criticism of an individual implied and might be construed as similar to forms of anti-Asian racism that existed hundreds of years ago. And that's the general form. Explicit attacks on the entirety of a race, when they're directed at Europeans, are of no consequence, whereas the mere association that could come from criticizing a specific journalist and a specific communication from that journalist might be profoundly moral evil because of its similarity to something that occurred before any of the authors in question were born. And the funniest thing is that Andrew Sullivan and Robbie Soave don't see this. Jeet Heer is one of the most prominent writers for the New Republic, the magazine that in many ways made Andrew Sullivan's career, at least when it came to blogging in the internet. The New York Times is this country's paper of record, and they didn't miss a beat in this scandal. They did not blink for a second. And the only thing that I'm curious about after all of this, after seeing what's been said, after watching all of the reactions, is not how could the New York Times hire Sarah Jeong. It's how could people like Andrew Sullivan and Robbie Soave not realize what decade they're in? Who do they think they're talking to? Who do they think is actually going to engage with the message that they're telling an audience? There's certainly not anyone of my generation or younger who doesn't know that these attitudes exist in the mainstream. Do they think they're communicating with the New York Times subscription base? Is there somebody who's a stalwart New York Times reader who doesn't realize that they're using a definition of racism that cannot be applied to bigoted statements directed at people of European descent. I mean, if they exist, they must have missed the articles last year where the New York Times questioned whether black children should be taught to be friends with white children. Indeed, I think that we all know who actually is reading and agreeing with Andrew Sullivan and Robbie Sove on the issue of Sarah Jeong's comments about white people, and that is more or less the people who are disgruntled with the progressive establishment. Populists and intellectuals on the distant right who see the mainstream, insofar as it includes PBS and the New York Times and NPR, as totally alienating, and who devoutly wish that these institutions would hurry up and die. Those are the people who are interested in hearing about how Sarah Jeong is racist, and those are the people who are bolstering Robbie Sove and Andrew Sullivan's voice in this discussion on Twitter and in other social media. They're speaking to the dissidents against the establishment. They're talking to the peasants about the decadence of the king. Sullivan and Sove in this capacity are rabble-rousers. They're instigators, and like rabble-rousers and instigators of old, they're not greeted by the establishment with an invitation to a debate. They're simply dismissed and cast to the side, treated like kooks who probably have a moral defect or two. And certainly that's to be expected. That's how establishments defend themselves against criticism from the outside. Certainly, if I were in their position, being dismissed by establishment forces as a kook and a weird person on the internet who had no legitimacy, I'd more or less expect that. I know that my role here is one of dissidence. I know that my role on the internet is arguing for a position that has long been out of favor in the establishment, and what I'm asking for is for something radical, for something new to come in. And I understand, pretty much as an assumption of this entire YouTube channel, that most of these ideas are not going to get platformed anywhere in the modern academy or in the mainstream media. I know that, and I am not surprised by the reaction of institutions like the New York Times or any other element of the academy. They will dismiss and discredit me because they have to. But the problem is I don't think that Robbie Sove and Andrew Sullivan realize the position they're in. They act like there's some kind of meta-debate going on in our society, as if there's this group of moderates who deeply care about the issue of culture and racism in society, but who aren't on one side or the other. They think that the establishment has some kind of obligation to hear this out in a neutral environment, or that they're going to get some kind of hearing in the court of public opinion that will matter insofar as these institutions like the New York Times and the university system are concerned. And of course, in 2018, that's ridiculous. And I understand it wasn't ridiculous to believe this in the 80s or the 90s or even the 2000s. But in 2018, that idea, that perception of the cultural ecosystem we now inhabit is ridiculous. And Andrew Sullivan and Robbie Sove should be asking themselves, why did the New York Times hire Sarah Jeong? Unfortunately, though, when people like Sullivan and Sove ask themselves this, I don't think that the answer can be flattering. And to really go a little bit further, I think we would need to look at the careers of these two journalists in turn, starting with Andrew Sullivan. Now, a lot of people who are younger listening to this channel might not know who Andrew Sullivan is. He was a fairly famous author in the 80s and 90s who then grew to an increased prominence by his blogging, and his blogging associated with the Atlantic Monthly magazine. Now, Andrew Sullivan was a strange character from the beginning. He called himself a conservative. But really, when it came down to it, he held very few classically conservative principles. He himself, being an openly gay man, was an early promoter of the concept of gay marriage in the 90s, and post a late disillusionment with the policies of the Bush administration, then went all in on the Obama revolution and the subsequent policy and cultural changes brought forth in the years between 2008 to 2016. Sullivan's conservatism really stemmed from two things. The first one being a type of neoconservative, anti-communism, and pro-humanitarian intervention that led him to support George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq. But at a deeper level, Sullivan's identity as a conservative stemmed from his principle that societal and cultural change always needed to come through gradual means, and that a conservative's job was to essentially facilitate necessary change at a very, very gradual pace to minimize the damage it might cause to social cohesion. Now, of course, to the reactionary generation on YouTube, I'm sure everyone can see the massive problems with this philosophy. But in the 90s and the 2000s, those attitudes paired with a more or less explicit anti-communism was enough to allow you to use the term conservative, without a whole lot of criticism. Still, in my own mind, as someone who started reading him around 2007 and continued going forward into the Obama years, I remember Andrew Sullivan largely as somebody who was a vociferous critic of any type of radicalism on the right. Any type of insurgent social conservatism, any type of emergent orthodox religiosity was confronted by Andrew Sullivan as if it were the greatest threat that the Republic had ever known. This is a person who greeted the Tea Party and the Glenn Beck era anti-Obama politics with utter horror, and even came up with a new name for Orthodox Christians called Christianists, obviously trying to invoke the fear that was already vested in the word Islamists. Andrew Sullivan never met a stalwart conservative of the Republican variety that he didn't feel was worthy of his disapprobation. Nevertheless, he called himself a type of conservative, and in 2009 onward, this type of conservatism even had a name. The sort of David Brooks variety of conservatism, where the intellectuals are literally just trying to dampen down and slow the progress that is being proposed by the left and make sure that it occurs with less disruptive consequences. This type of conservatism was called Sherpa conservatism, insofar as that you're just sort of part of the landscape, helping progressivism meet its ultimate goal. Something that I think very few conservatives who aren't literally getting paid for their opinions ever find to be a reasonable or sane position to hold. Nevertheless, this was Andrew Sullivan's brand, and sure enough, as the Obama administration became more advanced, as we started going into 2013 and 2014, Sullivan himself took a long hiatus from his commentary on public affairs, returning again only in the post-2016 insanity to poke his head up and see what the culture war he in many ways was responsible for defining had played out in the last several years. And indeed, wouldn't you know it, he thinks that the left has gotten too extreme, too unreasonable. It needs to pull back a little bit. It needs to go back to its roots in reason and rationality. But is anyone listening to Andrew Sullivan? Should they listen to Andrew Sullivan? Certainly, if the course of progress was some type of merit system, where people were rewarded with authority for the work they had done for the cause, Andrew Sullivan would certainly be meritorious under that lens. More than anyone else, at least in the North American context, Andrew Sullivan helped normalize gay marriage, and by extension, the entire cause of sexuality-based identity politics. Andrew Sullivan was the person who normalize same-sex marriage for a moderate audience. He's the person that made the case at the most basic level. He brought the idea of gay marriage out of the Castro and the Village and took it into a mainstream platform and presented it to a mainstream moderate audience. That, combined with will and grace, was the path that gave the progressives gay marriage, that gave them really everything they have in that dimension now. But of course, progressivism doesn't work like that. Virtue is not gained by achieving goals or helping goals to be realized. Virtue is gained by going further to the left. And in realizing this, one can instantly see the utter futility of even the abstract concept of Sherpa conservatism. It doesn't matter how many hurdles Sullivan has helped the progressives overcome in the past. He's on the right in this issue, and therefore he's in the wrong. He's working against the flow of history, and it does not matter if he has some kind of reasonable argument. Jeet here can dismiss him as a racist all the same. He doesn't have a platform, at least not in the world where it counts. But herein lies the rub when we ask the question, why did the New York Times hire Sarah Jeong? Because the reason why they could hire her, the reason why they could expect to be the paper of record and never have to answer for radical beliefs, is people like Sullivan. Sullivan's task, Sullivan's mission, Sullivan's accomplishments was unilateral disarmament of the socially conservative right wing. It was the castration of the right in any meaningful sense. He could witness the radicalization of the academy between the 90s and the late 2000s and still see the only problem in American culture as the religious right. He could watch the domination of the mainstream media by left-leaning journalists and still think that Glenn Beck was responsible for the problems of American incivility in politics. He waved all of this through with no objection, all the while playing the part of the conservative for these institutions to essentially claim that they had a diverse perspective on the world and were speaking for a variety of political persuasions inside the American cultural sphere. And now he turns around and is surprised about the result. Now, of course, perhaps Andrew Sullivan is a bad example. He is the quintessential fake conservative, the quintessential token conservative that's put up by some left-leaning magazine like The Atlantic and held out as a justification for hiring radicals on the other side. But I think the problem goes deeper, and you can see the problem go deeper in people like Robbie Soave, the second person who was very prominent in his criticism of the hiring of Sarah Jeong at the New York Times. Now, of course, Robbie Soave is a much younger man. He's even a little bit younger than me, and there isn't nearly the kind of history that Sullivan has. Indeed, looking at Robbie Soave's profile, he is indeed a true conservative. He believes in all the things the Republican Party does. His ideas would be more or less at home at the National Review. Indeed, the most notable journalistic achievement that Soave has to his name is the exposure of the UVA Rolling Stone rape hoax. Yet even after all of this, Soave is part of the same problem that Sullivan is. And in Soave's case, it's less about his record, about his dishonesty regarding his ideological convictions. I think he's perfectly straightforward with what he believes, and he's probably very honorable in his conservative credentials. But rather, the difficulty is in the way he approaches these issues. And once again, he's speaking as if somehow he has the ability to appeal to these institutions. He talks about the New York Times in terms of the standards they have. He talks about racism like it's this defined quantity that we can measure, and that the New York Times recognizes it as this defined quantity that applies irrespective of race and historical context. He still thinks that his job is to hold these institutions like the New York Times and the university system to account, when really they're unaccountable. Unaccountable at least to anyone like him, to anyone who has unorthodox views. And so what you see reading Soave is just this exercise in utter futility. I mean, what does he think is going to be accomplished by complaining about the New York Times double standard? Does anyone not realize this exists? Does anyone think someone's going to do something about it? Does anyone believe that there is even a splinter cell inside the New York Times editorial board that wants the kind of reform Robbie Soave is calling for? The answer to all these questions is obviously no, and nobody who's paying attention to politics could think otherwise. Soave and Sullivan are voices on the outside. But furthermore, in addition to not being listened to, they serve a role that is the main problem when it comes to dealing with organizations like the New York Times. They create the appearance of controversy. They create the appearance that these ideas are contested inside the circles where they're being promulgated. And it's this false appearance that's the real problem. It's this delusion that we're putting ourselves through that is spawning more and more Sarah Jeongs and the need for politics like Sarah Jeong. The game wouldn't work without people like Sullivan and Soave playing it. Imagine for a minute if we could cut out all of the moderates, all of the old baby boomers who work at the New York Times, all of the Gen Xers from the 80s and 90s who still think we're going to enter into the global village and who are skeptical of identity politics. What if the only two forces in politics were the radicals of the identitarian and socialist left and the dissident right? Would there be this problem? Well, I'm not so sure there really would be. Demands would be made from one side to the other, and each would unilaterally ignore the other. Institutions would be split, and perhaps both the dissident right and the left could discuss a way to restructure the system. But such a discussion would go on more or less like foreign policy, with both sides being known adversaries, as opposed to members of a contested and divided whole. Personally, I find the prospect of reaching some kind of settlement with this more honest approach a lot more tenable, a lot more conceivable. I mean, a division of political power when it's done honestly is actually not a very complicated maneuver at all. The only complication enters in when we have some kind of idea of an obligation that one side has to reciprocate that the other does not respect, or if there is some kind of large cultural inheritance or institutional inheritance that one side feels they deserve and the other does not. And when you're looking at things this way, you can see the utterly pathological role that people like Sullivan and Soph play in this process. First, by going to radical anti-Western identitarians and convincing them that they are the heirs of institutions that were built and designed in the West. By convincing the left writ large that they are destined to eventually take control not just of some of the levers of cultural control, but in fact all of them. Second, these figures like Sullivan go forward to the mainstream of society and continuously sell that public a false bill of goods. They tell the public that the institutions under their new leadership will respect concepts such as racism being a universal evil, applicable to any race, telling the public generally that the New York Times will continue to entertain a variety of views, telling Christians and social conservatives that the institution of marriage won't largely be changed by the introduction of homosexuality into it, and assuring Americans generally that the Western and constitutional order of America will not largely be changed once the hardcore identitarian faction of the progressive left takes ultimate power. This has largely been the explicit job of Andrew Sullivan throughout most of his career, to paper over a transition of power whose ultimate results he can't stomach. And ultimately, this is the system that Robbie Sove is playing into, making objections with the expectation of reciprocation from institutions that have no desire or even ability to play by the rules that were originally set out. What's going on is a pantomime, when in fact we need an honest negotiation between two rival parties with explicitly opposed political ends. The moderates on both sides are playing a part in a delaying tactic, something that is stopping the ultimate conflict from coming to a head. And in putting that off, it's making things worse. It's making the disagreements we have more and more contentious, because the disagreements are becoming less and less honest. You don't need a weatherman to tell you when it's raining, and anybody can see what's happening inside the culture war. And that makes moderates a problem for people like me who want some kind of conclusion. This is the place we are right now. Sarah Jeong is hired by the New York Times. Her views are mainstream inside the New York Times. They weren't jokes. They weren't satire. They weren't a reflection of trolls' attitudes. They are a perspective that is mainstream in the media and in academia in 2018, which is that opposition to racism and bigotry only goes one way and only can go one way going into the future. This is the reality we live in. There is no moderate position left. You are either on board with these institutions wielding the power they have, or you are a distant and a rabble-rouser on the outside trying to lobby for change against a system that you should have no expectation will listen to you or platform your ideas. The role that the moderate left and the mainstream right have been playing in our political discourse is fundamentally a lie. And so everyone who is on the left, everyone who is in the middle, everyone who is on the moderate right wing needs to ask themselves a question. Do you like the reality of a New York Times run by people who have Sarah Jeong's views? Do you like the idea of an academy run by people who have Sarah Jeong's views? Do you like the idea of an educational system teaching your children, staffed and administered by people with Sarah Jeong's ideas? If the answer to this question is yes, then you are part of the left and you are part of the left's political project. And at this point, you must follow it to where it eventually leads. Much is made of the slippery slope fallacy, but at the core, this argument has one central truth, and that is cultural and political movements do not exist as autonomous elements. One assumption consequently leads to another, on and on and on until you get to the final end. And if you're on the progressive train now, you will follow that train to its final destination. And although the progressive train might be promising you institutional power in the moment, I would be very surprised if it could promise you that same institutional guarantee going forward, at least if you're a man or a woman from European descent. However, if you do not like the idea that people like Sarah Jeong dominate the cultural institutions and the academic institutions of your society, then you are on the dissident right. You are a dissident. You are a rebel. You are opposed to the mainstream of the society that you occupy. You are in effect a cultural rebel, and your only option is to find some course of action that can give people like you, and indeed people like me, some separate peace, some solid sovereignty away from the institutions dominated by people who have no interest in moral reciprocation towards our cause. But with that, I'll close. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and a good rest of the week.